soared up to the rafters, perched on a beam up there. Cried the stink of human sin, the stink of human sin, the stink is more than I can bear.
And if we are to continue to spend our mornings together, as we have done now for many years, then I suspect one of the things that's going to change as the world turns is the dependence of people like me upon newspapers, upon traditional media. I am still, I'm afraid, very, very much linked by an umbilical cord. As with Nick, and I'm not just a former newspaper man myself, but I am the son of a newspaper man, and weaning myself off that mode of news delivery is incredibly difficult. And I'm not in a desperate rush to do it, but as we often observe on this programme, the ludicrously biased nature of the print media in this country, the way it so obviously and explicitly serves the purposes of a tiny cabal of billionaire owners, all of whom were, for example, pro-Brexit, is actually ridiculous. And today is one of those days where we will be wading into journalism that has been done beyond that pool, outside that pool. Private Eye have rather led the field on the individuals who've trousered, frankly, unbelievable sums of money in the delivery of so-called PPE contracts. I mean, what would you think? Genuinely, if you've got no clue at all and you're sitting here thinking, oh, what's he on about now? What sort of figure would you think a single individual making a profit from the provision of PPE contracts or the equipment that was desperately needed at the beginning of the pandemic and moving forward? One individual whose job is, heading up a big firm, some of which only really came into meaningful existence to apparently deliver these contracts. We're going to talk very shortly, about the issue of how you landed a contract like this, which I think is really important. It's a Russian doll day today, is what I'm trying to say to you, is that every time you pull the lid off one of them, there's another one underneath. So what sort of figures? If I said to you, so-and-so made £1 million, would you think, crikey, that's a hell of a lot of money to cream off the top of a PPE contract? Or would you think, oh, come on, James, grow up. This is Brexit Britain. £1 million is chicken feed. I honestly don't know where you sit on this. I think I would probably think that £5 million to one person for merely presiding over contracts at a time of national crisis was ridiculously excessive. I don't know how you gauge this sort of thing, but what constitutes a big jackpot for you? What, when you buy a lottery ticket, would be a life-changing sum of money? It's different for many, many people. I've told you the other day that for some bizarre reason, I go out and buy a ticket when it's the Euro Millions jackpot and when it's hit sort of 9 figures, when you're looking at £120 million. I go out and buy a ticket when I don't often buy them, when it's a mere 5 million. But for the avoidance of doubt, £5 million would be completely and utterly life-changing for me and mine. But what sort of figure would just stop you in your tracks? If I said, that fella over there, he made £500,000 last year simply for being in charge of a company providing PPE. Because just with no particular order, there's a company called Ianda Capital, 3 members of which made, respectively, £20.3 million, £32.4 million and £11.6 million. They were referred to the so-called VIP scheme by a chap called Darren Blackburn, who works in the Cabinet Office. I could and will go on. £16.4 million for someone else, 20 million, 15.9 million, 8.5 million, 3.85 million pounds for a chap called Rupert Soames, the head of Serco. And on it goes. Every partner at Deloitte made an average £854,000 on the back of COVID contracts. I need a little bit of help with this story. Thankfully, Peter Gagan, the editor-in-chief of Open Democracy and author of the book Democracy for Sale, Dark Money and Dirty Politics. Also, I think it's fair to say, one of my brothers in arms when it comes to unveiling the reality of the think tanks that have done so much to pollute political life and media discourse in this country, joins me on the line now. Peter, it is quite hard to know where to start. Would it be desperately unprofessional of me to ask you to pick and choose?
It is really, isn't it, James? And just so your listeners are aware of this as well, the context for this information that leaked out this morning. This is a list of all of the various VIP, the politically connected VIP firms that got these COVID contracts. The government tried to stop this list coming out. Here at Open Democracy, we ended up going to the Information Commissioner. And actually, they had until the next week to publish this list. And instead it leaks out this morning, which is very typical government behaviour too, where they're trying to, kind of try and kill stories, frankly. And it's so great to have somebody like you really going through this. And what this list that Politico got the scoop on shows is just the sheer extent of this. You can see why the government didn't want this out. This is 47 different firms who collectively got hundreds and hundreds, if not billions of pounds in COVID contracts that were funneled through by politicians, some of whom said that they weren't involved in this, and now we can see that they are. And the sums of money are massive. I'll probably return to one or two that you've skirted on. One name that jumped out at me was a company called Mellor Designs, which is set up by a Tory donor. The Mellor Designs had a 9,000% increase in their profits last year. £13 million in the back of COVID contracts. So we awarded over £160 million. We can see that went through the Cabinet Office, which was Michael Gove's office at the time. Ayanda Capital, which you mentioned there, which provided basically...
Just to pause you there, David Mellor, the head of that company, Mellor with two E's, nothing to do with the former politician, and his brother Michael, I think 16.4 million quid each.
Yes, yeah, huge sums of money, life-changing sums of money. Even you were asking how much is £1 million. I think that is a life-changing sum of money. And they would
actually, that's 1,000 lives changing sum of money, completely. Isn't it? It's incredible. And as you say, the percentage increase in what they were turning over prior to the COVID pandemic is in four figures, into four figures.
And they're not the only ones. You mentioned Ayanda Capital there as well, this company, another very politically connected company. They got a £250 million contract for personal protective equipment, PPE. A lot of the equipment they supplied was found to be faulty, but nonetheless, they had a humongous increase in their profits, huge amount, up again 4 figures in the percentage. And we can see from this list as well how they were connected in to this VIP lane. And it's worth stressing time and again that the government have basically said that there's nothing to see here, that this is all completely above board, this is all standard. But how standard is it to have, even just looking at the names of some of these firms, James? Some of these firms are new to people like me who've been in the weeds of this for a long time. You've got companies with names like Skinny Dip Limited. Skinny Dip Limited were referred by Lord Feldman, the former Tory party chairman, who's in the House of Lords, just as it happens, like many other well-connected Conservatives and well-connected Conservative donors. He referred Skinny Dip Limited and a number of other companies to the VIP lane, and they went on to get serious, huge COVID contracts. And so the scale of this, just even for someone who's been in the weeds of it, just is absolutely mind-boggling, frankly.
Do we have any estimate or indication of how much more likely you were to secure one of these contracts if you were referred by somebody like Lord Feldman, who, of course, is probably best known for being David Cameron's former tennis partner, or indeed the office of the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, aka Michael Gove? There's one here, Monarch Acoustics. Matt Hancock referred them. In fact, he also did 9. He was Health Secretary at the time, and who knows? It may well be that these were the best placed companies to provide these sort of contracts. But do we have any indication of how much more likely you were to land one of these incredibly juicy contracts, which delivered payouts to bosses in the tens of millions of pounds, compared to companies that didn't have access to this so-called VIP lane?
Well, the government's own watchdog, the National Audit Office, that estimated that companies in the VIP lane were 10 times more likely to get a government contract than companies that weren't. They found that what happened was they were considered by the government's PPE team to be, quote, more credible and treated with more urgency. They also didn't face the usual anti-corruption checks. And just to let you know, James, I actually started reporting this on these sort of issues back in kind of April of 2020, after a company in the north of England that made protective equipment got in touch with me saying, I'm trying to make equipment for this government and I can't get through to them. They were ringing this phone line run by Deloitte because the entire...
Just to pause you there, £854,000 on average was the profit share per partner via Deloitte's own share of COVID contracts, which would have included running the helpline, of course.
It did, and it meant that many companies who actually had experience in this area and were trying to get through couldn't get through. But those, as we can see, who were politically connected, who knew who to talk to. Because what's interesting about this list as well, it also kind of tells you who was the source of the referral and the actual referrer. And these are almost all of them either MPs or members of the House of Lords or significant government people who were doing this. So clearly your connection into politics was, as we say, it delivered huge profits.
We've got Dominic Cummings' name appears there as well. And these are, to be clear, these are leaked documents that were due to be published next week. So your calculation is the government were hoping that they'll attract rather less attention in this manner than they would if we'd waited for the official publication date. Why do you think that?
Well, we can't really know, but the government has had a tendency of trying to put out stories and very bad news in ways like this in the past, and possibly this isn't what's happened here, but it does feel very coincidental. The hope might be that this wouldn't attract the kind of attention it has, but frankly, I think the issue's so big here, no amount of spin is going to get you out of it.
Is it? In many ways, people unfamiliar with open democracy should know that yours is one of the organisations that bulks at no mountain, however high it may be. But I wonder whether this is one of those issues, one of those stories that is so huge, it's hard to get a toehold in it. Do you know what I mean?
I think there's something in that. I think for ordinary people, for people who aren't in the weeds, it can be almost difficult to see just the sheer scale of this, James. We're talking about billions and billions and billions of pounds.
And public money, we should be clear. Anyone under any illusions, we're talking about public money here exclusively.
Completely. We're talking about public money as well. This is public money worth billions of pounds. And it's been, and this is how it was divvied out. It's probably, we called it at Open Democracy the COVID gold rush when it started, because the sheer amount of money that was going out to these firms. And I think there is something in this about trying to contextualize it for people. Like £250 million is what Ianda Capital got. They're a politically connected firm, these huge profits to provide faulty PPE equipment. That's the kind of amount of money.
Some of the equipment they provided wasn't faulty, to be clear.
No, some of it wasn't faulty. No, and they, indeed.
And there's also storage issues as well, isn't there? Some of the stuff that was bought and not needed, the companies that are now charging for the storage are the companies that provided it in the first place.
Completely. So there's money that's been made all over it, all at various angles, at various ends of this, and the sums involved are just so huge, James. £250 million, £500 million. These are the kind of sums that can do huge amounts of good in terms of public money. We've had a decade of austerity. We've also been told that post-COVID we're going to have to cut back. These are the kind of sums of money that really are material. They're not just. It's not what Boris Johnson once referred to, the £250,000 he was paid for writing a Daily Telegraph column as chicken feed. This is not chicken feed.
So just to be clear on that Ianda Capital one, the £252 million worth of deals saw £64 million make its way into the pockets of three individual middlemen, half of that sum by one man, and some 50 million individual masks that they provided were found to be unusable as they had the wrong straps. And these contracts were brokered by an advisor to the government's Board of Trade. £32.4 million paid to a chap called Andrew Mills through the personal service company Prosper Mill that he owns jointly with his wife Caroline. Finally, Peter, because I'm a little late for the break already, this may sound facetious, but you'll see that there's a sort of nugget of plausibility at the heart of the question. It was urgent. It was an emergency. If it was, if I knew you had some experience in this field and we were mates or contacts, or someone I trusted said, speak to Gagan, he's your man for face masks. And I thought, well, we haven't got time to jump through all the usual hoops. We haven't got time to observe all the red tapes. I need these face masks yesterday. Is there a form of defence in that sort of argument, which I've already heard coming from some Conservative quarters?
I think there might be. If you're talking about April 2020, you can see how this would have happened. You can see how, in the rush to try and do something. But what's really striking is this continued for months, almost years into the pandemic. We were outsourcing our test and trace facility to Circle well into this year. Like, this is not something that just happened in the first few months of the pandemic, in which it was all kind of chaos and craziness. This was continued across the piece. And I think that's a huge and really important part of this. At the root of this, frankly, James, is the idea that the best way to manage this situation wasn't to do it through the government. It was to do it. It wasn't to do it through the state. It was to pay private companies to deliver this. Yes. And in some ways, this is the inevitable outworking of that.
Well, and I suppose you could say, well, yeah, that was the best way to do things in the urgent circumstances. But the amount of money trousered by individuals rather gives the lie to that there was some sort of emergency altruism in place. I promise I'll let you go after this. A few of my listeners are wondering, and I wonder if you've been nodding at this suspicion without actually articulating it, whether or not the timing of the leak could be linked to the appalling events, thankfully, nowhere near as tragic as they could have been in Liverpool 2 days ago. Just in terms of what's on the front pages and what is in the news.
I wouldn't know anything about, but in terms of the one thing I will say on when this story has come out, I think any attempt to try and to kind of move away from this story or move away from other stories through this story is just, I don't think it's going to succeed. I think the questions that this story raises, the fundamental questions about power and accountability in British politics, and the way in which, frankly, we've seen this large-scale cronyism revealed by people like Open Democracy and others, I feel like the scale of it, as we're talking about just right now, the scale of it's so huge, it's important for us to put it into the context that your listeners can understand, can identify with and empathise with, and it's important for us to keep telling it.
And indeed, if Open Democracy, the Good Law Project, and in this case, Private Eye, are the trawlers when it comes to this story, then we on this programme will continue to do our best to be seagulls. Peter Geoghegan, many thanks indeed. If you don't already follow the work of Peter and his colleagues at Open Democracy and indeed help them with your support, then frankly you should. How do we do this story together, you and me now? These numbers are genuinely staggering. Well, listen, I'm already very late for the break. I'll come back with some questions that we might be able to work our way through together. But if you think this isn't important, if you think this isn't cronyism, if you think this isn't the next chapter in the catalogue of corruption and sleaze that is engulfing the Conservative Party, then, well, I've got a lorry load of unusable PPE that I'd quite like to sell you. I did you a vague disservice when I told Peter Geoghegan that many of my listeners were suggesting the timing of this leak of companies that appear to have secured incredibly lucrative COVID contracts after being given a recommendation by members of the government or close associates. The timing may have been linked to the terrorist attack in Liverpool. Quite a few of you are wondering whether it's actually linked to the Select Committee that's currently looking into allegations of racism in cricket. We don't generally do conspiracy theories on this programme, but I think the timing of leaks get filed into a slightly different category, and we'll just file it under we don't know, okay? We don't know, we will see. But Azim Rafiq, the former Yorkshire player, is giving very, very damning evidence, and it is going to be extremely uncomfortable listening for at least one household name in the cricket world. We will be bringing you up to date with all those developments, certainly before 11 o'clock today, quite possibly even sooner than that. But just think about what we're talking about today. It is, why has this been leaked now when it was due to be published next week? And here are at least two stories that demand serious amounts of attention. The Cricket Select Committee in particular, and of course the terrorist attack from earlier in this week, less of a phone-in topic, but still a huge news story. And then back to the story that I think is absolutely immense, which is the tale of these COVID contracts. The Good Law Project, Gillian Morm's esteemed organisation, Open Democracy and Private Eye magazine, operating, I think, mostly independently, have unearthed, frankly, staggering stories of contracts being handed to companies after recommendations from members of government. Esther McVeigh is on the list, Matt Hancock is on the list, Steve Bryan, MP, is on the list. And there may be absolutely nothing questionable about it at all, which would pose the question, why was the government so reluctant to publish the details in the first place? So absolutely no suggestion of criminality or law breaking or anything like that. But what happened to you when you tried to get one of these contracts? I don't know if you remember, but one of the real eyebrow-raising moments on this programme in the sort of first 6 months of the pandemic was a call we took. It was from a woman, I think in Scotland, who worked for a ventilator company and was adamant that the ventilators they manufactured were fit for purpose, were really, really good ventilators. And she couldn't get a contact in the Department of Health for neither love nor money. And she rang us when it was too late. I said, well, what happened to the ventilators you had that were good to go? And she goes, like, we sent them overseas. They got bought by foreign governments. They got bought by foreign healthcare organisations because she couldn't get the contact that she needed. Now, you know, I sometimes set the bar quite high on this programme. I think this is as high as it gets. When I say to you, as a presenter on a radio phone-in programme here in London, I speak to the whole of the United Kingdom and beyond and say to you, did you try and get? Did you feel that you could help? Did you feel that your company actually could fill some of the needs that the government had when this pandemic began to sweep across the nation, but you didn't have access to this VIP lane? You didn't, because questions about why companies hire MPs as consultants, questions about why companies make donations to politicians fighting funds, questions about where the line lies between cronyism and consultancy, between sleaze and something even more sinister, are very live at the moment. And I want to come at it from this angle. And the angle is this. First of all, obviously, the phone lines are open for you to tell me what you make of this story. And if you want to argue that it's no big deal or it's another storm in a teacup, then you are, as always, very welcome. But if by chance you have your radio on today and you are either currently or have in the past 2 years, been quite high up in a company that could have fulfilled some of these contracts. So we're talking about everything from ventilators right down to face masks. You could have fulfilled some of these contracts, but you didn't have any contacts in the government or the cabinet office or the close circles surrounding the Conservative Party. How easy stroke hard was it? And again, I stress, you are more than welcome to ring in and tell me that actually you didn't have any contracts at all, but it was really easy. How easy or hard was it for you as a manufacturer of face masks, as a manufacturer of personal protective equipment, of robes? We heard, didn't we, about doctors and nurses having to sort of wear homemade equipment. How easy was it for you to get access to the decision makers? What happened when you rang those phone lines that Peter Gagan just told us about, set up by the government, but at a cost charged by Deloitte partners, who have an average profit share, according to Private Eye, of £854,000 per partner on the back of their COVID contract? How hard or easy was it for you as an experienced, successful business person to get access to the process under which these contracts were awarded? Because they were awarded largely without tender or without proper scrutiny, and of course with an attempt later by the government to keep the details from the people. 03456060973. So broad overview, but ideally you had a crack at getting one of these contracts, and you can tell the rest of us what happened. And I wonder if, having heard about the process or the people who secured these contracts, you're sitting there today thinking to yourself, okay, now I get it. The COVID contracts concern us, and you know, you look at the urgency with which the coverage of that cricketing story or that racism story demands, and you do, I'm afraid, and listen, I'm as susceptible sometimes to seeing smoke without there being any fire as anybody else is, but you do wonder whether the timing of this leak was a complete coincidence. Is the timing of leaks ever coincidence? What would we be talking about this time next week, for example, if this was the only story? And I don't know, but I do know this. The list of MPs who have given a recommendation to companies that went on to secure enormously lucrative COVID contracts, seeing in many cases individuals take home tens of millions of pounds of what had previously been public money, is absolutely breathtaking. Andrew is in Beaconsfield. Andrew, what can you tell us?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Yeah, I did try and get hold of you at the time because this was a very similar experience to the lady you were talking about with the ventilators, where we just were absolutely unable to contact anybody. I run a medical device company that supplied the NHS for over 30 years. We had a couple of things happen. One, I had the week before lockdown, I had a friend in Germany contact me.
Yeah.
They had millions of masks, millions of South Korean test kits. And he basically said, if you can get somebody to fly over, any time now, we've got bundles of PPE. And I just wanted to let you know. So I did that, spent most of the next 2 or 3 days trying to contact people. This is before it felt quite so urgent. We then realised that we weren't going to get access to his stuff because it was, other governments around the world were flying planes in.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'd managed not to contact anybody. I got so desperate after about 3 days, I actually even called our local police and said, did they have any access to, who do we contact? One of the major things we did do, obviously, we went down our normal supply channels.
Yeah.
So we went to all of our local hospitals, all of the purchase managers that we know, all over we know purchase managers all over the country.
30 years worth of experience here coming into play.
Yeah, exactly. And they were stopped from purchasing. So they were told there would be central supplies. Obviously, they didn't want to ruin their own budgets by purchasing locally. I then started, and this was one of the huge mistakes, I think, because I then started to talk to other colleagues. We were talking to each other. We were all closed down at the time, obviously, because we didn't, little that we could supply. So we were all spending our lives on the phone and trying to get through to the government, saying that most of us had access to a reasonable amount of PPE.
Right.
You didn't need to go down the chain, huge centralised supply.
So you could ramp up the system that already existed rather than having to build new ramparts.
Exactly. The system that existed could have carried on supplying the hospitals quite easily, I think. So instead of letting them run out because there was, they were awaiting a central supply, they could easily have contacted trusted suppliers and said, "Can you get us any?" Now, the other major reason that we could is that a lot of products these days come from China, and we're in a, nearly all PPE comes from China. So at the time, we actually do have an import license from China. So we are actually a sort of authorized medical supplier with a supply chain from China. So it would have been cheaper. There was no, we weren't looking to profit from it. This is something we said quite regularly. It's like if somebody can contact us, we have product. We don't want to profit. We just want to get it out there. We were watching the news, obviously, and seeing nurses dressed in black bags.
Yes.
This is one of the things I find disgusting as well when you hear later on from people like Matt Hancock that there wasn't a problem.
Yeah.
We all watched it unfold, and we had access to product, and so did numerous colleagues. Now, we're not a big company,
right.
And my my competitors are not big companies. Every single one of us had access to PPE. And,
but you couldn't get through to people in a position to buy it centrally.
Nobody. You could not get through. So we had this strange. Initially, there was no way of getting through to anybody. There was no centralised purchasing set up.
So who were you? Just run me through who you rang before you felt compelled to ring the police, and then, if I may, I'm probably going to put you on hold and come back after the break.
I managed to get Matt Hancock's secretary number.
Really?
She put me back onto sort of a waiting list thing. Basically, suppliers. We were phoning hospital supplies departments and saying we've got it. And so you
normally buy 10,000 a year from me. If you need 50,000, I can sort you out.
Yeah, we don't supply it, and this is one of the things, James, that is how dodgy is this?
I don't know
who was supplying it, because we were immediately asked if we did get hold of somebody, because we occasionally did get called, local government, for instance. We're in South Bucks, and South Bucks Council were quite proactive at contacting us. After about 2 weeks, we managed to get a call back from them.
Right.
Now, the problem we then had was it was CE, provide this, provide the CE marking, provide advance, purchase details. It was like, well, you have to promise you're going to buy it, because the manufacturers are selling it to people who are cash rich, which is what the government ended up doing. But what's really frightening for us is that at all of the stages we had to go through, none of these companies could have done. So, they were checking CE marks, they were asking for, and when I saw the stuff that was starting to come through, I don't think that, I doubt very much these were hurried products, a lot of them.
Well, we know that one of these companies had 50 million face masks that couldn't be used because they had the wrong straps on them. So, oh, Lord.
Exactly that. So that's one of our frustrations, was that we knew we were dealing with kosher companies. We were checking, we're medical device companies. We know what we're looking for. We know what we have to provide. But we were just being ignored. And this went on and on.
And did you find this was reflected back at you by other competitors and colleagues? Were other people
Totally,
having similar?
totally.
And
I
were
got
you
one-
conscious? Were you aware of anybody who did have contacts in government? Did you know of any of your competitors who did actually manage to get?
No,
someone?
none of us. None of
Right.
us managed to get none of our. Now we don't work in PPE directly,
No.
so this was all being done. But we're all medical device companies who
Yes.
had access, and that's, as I say, that's why the central purchasing went, I think, very wrong as well. I know it's on a mass scale, but they could have elongated that. You know, they could have allowed places to buy it where they could find it until they got those central contracts arranged, because notoriously they don't work, and they didn't on this occasion. You know, we could have.
So you were the
provided-
least surprised person listening to the first half an hour of this programme today.
Yeah, totally unsurprised. I mean, I literally, I wish I hadn't had the first call from my German colleague,
Because
I spent the first month of not watching Netflix, but literally on the phone for 15 hours a day trying to get some sense out of people, and it was utterly impossible. And now, one horror story, a friend of mine actually bought 80,000 masks very early on.
right.
He ended up trying to give them away. He was actually told, and this is where I think it gets really dark, because the message that came from the government was also that masks don't work.
Yes.
And they were doing that because they didn't have any.
Well, they
So
would
you
they
can
would no doubt
imagine-
deny that, but that is your
That's
Occam's
exactly what was
razor.
happening, though,
Occam,
James. That
yeah.
was what was happening.
Okay.
So they started telling us that we could not sell those masks to anybody else. So, for instance, they had to only go to the NHS, because apparently they didn't work if you didn't work for the NHS.
Right.
So there we were. So I've had a friend who'd got £80,000 worth of masks. It's basically sitting in his garage trying to give them away and not being allowed to. This is how bizarre it got. So, you know, we're all fairly small suppliers, but
Sure.
we all have absolute direct paths to medical supplies companies in China and PPE companies, and it was all entirely ignored. And at the same time, then hearing the stories coming, and we were mystified. We were like, what is going on? Why can we not access anybody? And then when you heard the horror stories of how many millions was actually spent on products that, to be honest, I mean, they were just coming out of China through any means.
Well, never mind the products. No, I mean, how I'm going to use the word normal for want of a better one. Would a commission of, for example, £32.4 million on a £252 million deal be in normal times?
I can't see why anybody would be paid commissions on it. I genuinely can't.
Because you would be happy to take a markup on each individual.
Everybody would have taken I think any sensible company would have put a margin on the product. It would have been very minimal, because blatantly they needed millions of products. So, you know, there would have been a very marginal markup per item, probably. The idea of paying commission to people to sort of introduce you to companies when companies are begging you to talk to them just seemed really rather bizarre to me. I cannot see why.
Have you read Private Eye this week?
Yeah, I've read Private Eye since they started picking up on it.
Yeah.
I've been avid.
It is almost. You see what I mean by it being almost too big a mountain to get a toehold in. I mean, it is.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean,
it's epic.
it felt like it honestly felt at the time like we were going mad.
Yeah,
You know, you couldn't
yeah,
understand. I
yeah.
mean, I had calls, and it was the short-sightedness as well. So, for instance, I had one call from one government official who sort of said, "Yeah, we've got you registered, Andy, but we
Right.
need gowns." And I
Right.
said, "But I'm not a gown supplier. I can't, you know." So, but you're going to need masks, and you're going to need this and that. You know, there were numerous things that we'd listed, and they actually said, "No, we just want gowns," and it was like, "But are you going to phone me back again
Yeah.
in order to organise the masks or
Yeah.
any of the other things?" Because no, that call never came again. Never ever had another. So it was all incredibly frantic and short-sighted, and I can only assume that the people, and now I hate to say this, but the people that were, you know, organising these things that were, you know, you had the typical example of a jeweller, wasn't it, in Spain or
Yeah.
Florida or something,
Yeah.
who was paid a vast commission, because they were just making it up as they went along.
But they had
And
the
nobody
contact.
spotted it.
But they had the contact.
Yeah, but most of us have these contacts.
Not good enough
This is what-
contact.
Exactly. Oh, I see. I thought you meant contacts in China.
No, I meant the contacts that would get you referred to the VIP lane,
basically,
which would give
yeah,
you a
exactly.
10-time greater chance of getting a contract than if you weren't on the VIP lane. I'm going to
Yeah,
add myself from what I've learned this morning, irrespective of experience or expertise.
Yeah, Totally.
Wow.
But how did they have those? I mean, it's mystifying, isn't it? When you look at the sort of people that were, you know, as I say, to go down centralised purchasing was always a big move, you know, a sort of war footing almost, when it was unnecessary, I think, at the time. Definitely unnecessary to stop individual units ordering their own. I think the care homes had this problem as well, is that they were effectively told, sit tight and we'll get it to you, when they could have been ordering it from any medical company. You know,
and then so the decision on why they didn't hang. I suspect we might talk again. I hope we do. I'm sorry for what you've been through, but my goodness me, it's hard to think of someone who was closer to the action than you were, except of course the people who've got the contacts in government and did secure these contracts. It would seem, regardless of how much expertise and or experience they have, a bit of a pattern emerging, and many of you, including George in Kempston, remembering that the call we took, maybe we took more than one. You'll forgive me for not having a fully functioning memory, but the listener who was alleging that the reason this government was delaying some of its decision making was to let the people that it wanted to give the contracts to get their ducks in a row in order to profit. That's the problem with an absence of clarity in leadership. Anything can move into the space that is left, but the criteria for getting one of these COVID contracts seems to be, when you look at the work of the Good Law Project, of Open Democracy and of Private Eye, seems to be 85% who you know and 15% what you know. But of course, we'll reserve the right to continue to dig into this story. 10:57 is the time. Dave's in Croydon. Dave, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James.
Hello, Dave.
Yeah, so basically, I guess the time during trying to sell reagents into the UK for COVID-19 testing on a PCR machine was probably one of the most traumatic times during my life, trying to get it through. So essentially, we came across the company I was working for were making reagents in Japan for PCR testing for COVID-19. These were actually devised when the Princess liner was in Tokyo Bay. Some microbiologist swabbed somebody from that liner, created the reagents, and they were starting to be supplied around the world. They were tested in a number of countries in Europe. I met a guy at an airport to bring him into the UK to get him tested in the UK hospitals or UK laboratories. We were in the process of doing that, but in a number of other countries in Europe, they've been tested and been verified to be working. So I got in contact with Health Education and with the UK Central Health Authority to get them validated. And
so you had access to the reagent, and you wanted to find someone in the Department of Health who would buy them.
Yeah, exactly. Essentially, so the process of doing that was extremely complicated. First of all, there was an Excel sheet that you had to fill in online, and you had to provide everything that was, all the verifications, etc., online, and then do it. And I did that 4 times, over a process over a time of about 2 months. Okay, we were getting nowhere.
Did anyone get back to you?
No, they changed the application process 4 times. We had a list of every microbiologist in the UK that we were trying to lobby, we were trying to get to say that we had these reagents, we could bring millions of them into the UK, and they replied. If it didn't go to an out of office reply, because most of them were out of office replies at the time. When the people that did come back said no, they had no power to buy anything, they couldn't buy anything. There was no way they could. It had to go centrally. We tried to go centrally. We didn't get a single reply ever. From our central attempts. We lobbied a number of people. We're even lobbying people in the House of Lords, local Chamber of Commerce.
You mean random people in the House of Lords, people you didn't go to school with, or have particular contacts with them, or maybe you did. I don't know.
Well, somebody gave me a couple of contacts, but they kind of got nowhere. But then we brought in the British Chamber of Commerce, from a business point of view, to see if we could do something about it. They couldn't help, but it was raised up as far as they could, and the people that we're talking to were as frustrated there as well in the British Chamber of Commerce.
Well, if you'd known Lord Feldman, he said, and this is on the record, he said, I was an unpaid volunteer during the early days of the pandemic, which involved considering offers sent in from potential sources of PPE or other medical supplies. He says, I had no previous knowledge of SG Recruitment, Skinny Dip and Maxima, and I had never had any commercial relationship with them or their owners. I passed their offers on to officials who considered them in accordance with DHSC procurement rules. So if you'd known him, you could have got your offers passed on to
I literally got on the phone sometimes at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning and sat there till 7 o'clock at night trying to find people. And you know, we did this over a couple of months.
How did it end? I'm late for the news, so I need to force you to the end of the story. Yeah. Did you ever get any? Did you ever manage to?
No, we never got anywhere.
Jeez.
And just why, you know, with the previous chaps talking about PPE and stuff. Yeah. So we also tried to bring PPE into the country. Right at the very end, we found most of the CE marks were fake, were false. I could find that. Okay,
right.
But seemingly, people from the government who brought in stuff from Turkey.
You know, we haven't even mentioned that massive container load coming in from Turkey that we were all supposed to be getting excited about, and then when it arrived, it turned out to have been sent by Derek Trotter's Turkish cousin.
Just leave you with one more thing, James.
Quickly.
At the moment, I'm a consultant for another company. Yeah. I'm out there at the moment trying to find about 350 ventilators that were bought sight unseen, and nobody knows where they are in the UK at the moment.
Have you read Private Eye this week?
I haven't read it.
Go seriously, because we know that there is March and April 2020 orders for mechanical ventilators from dozens of suppliers ran to 244 million. You may actually get a clue. You may get a lead if you get hold of Private Eye this week and their big report into this sort of stuff, because the ventilators are a whole section of their own. But let us know if you find them, Dave. Keep in touch, whatever you do, because this story is, as I've suggested a few times, absolutely immense.